And great, Megan posted a question I asked from Cruz Miguel Rodriguez. So great. Thanks, Megan, for posting that. That was posted in the Alchemy group, which Megan started, and she's posted the link several times in the NHP team to get over there. Appreciate that. So great. I have some good things to share, and then they'll relate to that question. Oh, great. Probably some pretty decent opportunity as well, hopefully. But anyway, best wishes with dealing with that positively or however. Okay. So let's take a look at this question that was part of what helped me think about the things I'm talking about today. But I had some things related that I was already planning on covering. So I'll read it. He wrote, so I'm trying to understand confidence, not being intimidated by others or small business owners. David Mills said that it is important to get over this threshold. So I want to get more info about it. Do you guys recommend any books or David's training that will help me with this? Thanks, guys. I've been dealing with anxiety for a while. I understand that I have to keep building and there's going to be a process. Thanks, family. Okay. So that's part of, it's not, I'll basically be answering the question, but I'm not going to directly address the words or not. I just kind of go into some things I'll be talking about in a moment that'll relate to that. And then I can maybe refer back to the question itself. And Megan asked something that's somewhat related, somewhat not. She said, David, I have a question about something I'm trying to dig all the way underneath that might be related to tonight's talk. Would you give us your understanding of self-righteousness or pride or self-conscious confidence in the negative sense, how it can seem? This is at least part of this is fairly simple, so I can address it just to kind of get rolling here. Sometimes it helps get me going just to answer a question or so that are fairly easy. One thing we want to avoid fully, and we do that by seeing how it's crazy, that can't be true, is what we don't want to do is judge people in an overall general sense, and we don't want to judge ourselves as superior in an overall general sense. We can guess that we are better if you're really good at tiddlywinks and you are the net state champion, then it's silly. It's a silly form of humility that wouldn't make any sense if our definition of humility involved deciding that we were bad at, or just we had no idea if we were good at tiddlywinks or not. But what we don't want to do is judge in an overall sense. Oh, that means I'm better. And what people do is they'll do that by prioritizing certain standards, right? Or you could imagine someone who's like a fashion snob, right? It's one thing to have a better sense of cultural fashion in a particular area than other people, right? There's people that obsess about that, and they could correctly suppose that they have more knowledge about that than me, for example, right? But then what people do, and the answer to your question, or a part of the answer to the question that's significant, Megan, is that what's different is to decide that standard, like that, whether or not being good at fashion is more important than being good at something else, right? But some people get into a mindset where they generalize it or they prioritize that standard in an overgeneralized way, right? Where they'll genuinely feel like they're better than people because they dress it. And there's a drive to feel superior in a general sense that people tend to have. It relates to the drive it's all kind of circular or a vicious cycle based on an inability to see what we're standing on, right? The frame that we're standing on and the outer frames that the frame we're standing on is inside as well. So an inability, because we can't see, we need to use some other method in order to understand where, like, the perspective that we're using, that like the various assumptions we're making that we use to see. There's a mental image that I want us to have that I want to give you in this webinar. I'll give it right now. It's an oversimplification, but oversimplifications are useful in as much as they're useful. And so this will have plenty of use. And I'll try to point out when the oversimplification matters, but there'll be plenty of times when the kind of oversimplified part doesn't matter. It's just nicely simple and profound. And I've given you something like this before, but I want to make sure we have this kind of a picture similar to this. And that is, if you picture, I don't know what you individually tend to picture when I talk about a succession of frames, inside and outside frames, but to make sure we're on the same page, if you picture a succession of frames where there's like an outer box, right, outer square, and then there's maybe multiple squares, or at first you can picture another square inside that square and then another square inside that. Then you could picture that, or you could picture at some point that there's more than one square inside of each square, and then you can zoom into one of the sub squares, and in there is one or more squares inside of it. And then So there's one way or another, picture a succession of smaller squares. And you don't have to see it vividly, but if you can quote the concept and feel and see it it's the kind of thing where you don't have to picture it vividly, but you can imagine what I'm talking about probably pretty well. And then imagine that you or any person is standing with their like feet, let's say, on one of the squares like in the middle of the succession. So a number of squares for that person who's standing where they're standing are inside of the box, so to speak. And then there's right. You probably get that. There's squares inside of the box they're standing on, and then there's squares inside of those squares and so forth. All of those can be basically seen. And then I want you to imagine that wherever the person's standing, they can't see the square they're standing on. It's like they're seeing with it, but they don't see it. And then they also can't see the outer squares outer to what they're standing on. So I want you to have that mental image, right, of successive squares, and you're standing in a place in the middle. Oh, hey, super. Cruz is here. What did you say here? You probably let him know. Super. Great. Appreciate that. So we have the mental image of these successive squares. Does everyone basically have that? Or do you want me to clarify? I know I'm pausing here but tell me if that makes some sense. Okay. Can I clarify once more? Got it. All right. And hopefully Cruz is on. He'll hear this now. I'm saying the second time. I want to give you a mental picture that we're going to use for some of what I'll talk about. And it's also helpful for what I've talked about in the past. But I want to make sure you have this specifically that we can refer to. And so what I want you to picture, I know I'm doing this with words, not visually, but that's okay. I want you to have it in your mind. And you don't have to picture it like vividly, but picture it the same way you can picture something that you can understand. Right? So first imagine there's one outer box, right? 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, whatever, outer box. Then inside that box, picture another box inside or frame. You could picture like on a piece of paper, there's a box drawn on the piece of paper. There's a smaller box in there. We're going to maybe run out of space in the paper if we start making smaller boxes, but then imagine you can zoom in on the paper and see the smaller boxes. Inside then of each box is either one box, or at some point you can start to picture there's multiple boxes that are separate, that don't overlap. There's multiple boxes. So let's say you have a box number 1, and then smaller than that is box number 2. Smaller than that is box number 3. Let's say inside box number 3, there's 4 boxes, right? Boxes 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4. Each of those boxes is there inside of square 3. They don't overlap with each other, let's say. And then if we look inside one of those boxes, 4.1, let's say, then there's more boxes inside of there that also don't overlap. They're all inside box 4.1. And we can keep zooming in and so forth. But there's an outer box. We can't zoom further out from the outer box. And there's no box outside of the outer box. So before I talk about where you're standing and so forth, do you have that with the boxes? You got the picture? Okay. And again, this is an oversimplification in one sense, but it's a very useful mental picture that I refer to in another sense. And the oversimplification part won't matter for a number of concepts. It'll just basically be very helpful to explain this mental picture. And then imagine that you or a person or a stick figure is standing with their feet on one of the boxes. And don't worry, like the person doesn't overlap with the boxes. If you're standing on a box, you're just standing on a box. Don't worry about whether if you're drawing the figure, it cuts into other boxes inside. Doesn't do that. You can imagine that the figure is just in a different dimension or whatever, but in a certain way, they're standing on one of the boxes, let's say box number 3, right? And so their feet are on there. And then conceptually, picture that person can see whatever's inside of box number 3, all the sub boxes inside box number 3 and the boxes inside of those. They can look or potentially look at any box inside of theirs, the one that they're standing on. They might have to squint or zoom in or whatever, but potentially they could see all the boxes inside. What they can't see, we're supposing, is the box that they're standing on. They might not even realize they're standing on a box at all. They're just seeing a bunch of boxes from their perspective. So there's us who's looking at the whole picture where we see all the boxes and the person standing on them. So actually it's good if you don't picture yourself for a second. Picture like a stick figure or a potential person. We can understand by looking at the whole thing that there's 3 boxes in this case. I arbitrarily picked that he's standing on the 3rd box, but in this case, there's 3 boxes that the guy does not see. He doesn't see the box he's standing on, and he doesn't see the box outside of the box he's standing on. He doesn't see the box outside of it, right? But there is no end and so forth, because I said there was only 3 boxes outside of where he was standing, or 2 outside of the one he's standing. But that contains the idea of what's really going on with our seeing and our thinking and our perspectives and our assumptions. And once we realize that what happens by default is people are really unaware that they're standing on the box that they're standing on. When they think that they can see the big picture and so forth, what's really happening is the following, right? What happens is people will get immersed or, you know what? Let's, it's great that we have this middle picture and now develop it one more way or make a tweak on it. When this person is standing with their feet on box number 3, in counting as the most outside box is number 1. When they normally look around, they see the actually like the smallest. Let's suppose there are smallest boxes, that the boxes don't get smaller and smaller indefinitely. Let's suppose that at some level number of 10, let's say, the boxes stop getting smaller and that's just it. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but this is very cool. This contains some really cool concepts that are very important for day-to-day life and thinking and all kinds of questions and confidence and all that. So we're going to need this as a backdrop. So when a person looks, they actually see boxes on level 10, let's say. And when they look around a little bit, they note the box on level 9. And if they try to think more deeply and so forth, they might think of the box on level 8. And ultimately, if they step back as far as they can go using their normal thinking, then they box number 3 that they're standing on is still fully invisible to them. And really doesn't exist to them. And they only see up to like box level 4 and down to 10. And what they need to do at that point is convince themselves that everything's okay with what they can't see. And they don't even realize they can't see it. It's more like to them, it feels just that everything's okay, that they're basically an okay or a good person, that everything will turn out basically okay, or their version of that to some degree, even if you feel anxiety and the anxiety, like what happens because this is the condition that people are in is that naturally leads to all of the things that people experience normally. Hey, Cruz, I'm glad you're on. I'm giving you a mental picture to start with, and then I'll continue from there about the successive frames. So if we think about how this person will go about their life and thinking about their life and so forth, and how they'll try to be confident, then because they don't understand the perspective and the assumptions that they're standing on, and they don't understand the things that led to that, like their method of coming up with assumptions and checking them and how to understand about God and so forth, whatever it might be, whatever the most outer things are, what a win really looked like, who they really are. All of that is invisible to them as an even potential concept to really think about. All they can see and all they can conceive of thinking about and seeing is what's within the boxes. And they think that they're thinking deeply when they go back a few boxes from the surface. And it gets harder and harder for them and more confusing. And they have no hope of using their normal methods. They have no hope of, there's no concept even of really getting their foundations understood and solid. And so when that's the case, if there's no hope of that, then you need to build a whole mental edifice, like a whole mental building and a way of understanding the world that makes up for the fact that you can't really know anything for sure because you also need to think these stuff. And so you're in this kind of constant dilemma and you need to try to be confident in order to make sales or do your business or get yourself out of bed in the morning or talk to people that you think might like you or whatever. And so people come up with ways to try to be confident and such. And what people will do as well is they'll make a whole thing that feels really wise out of going back a few frames, right? Like things like mindset is like a middle box in this scheme, right? It's not foundational. Like whether you feel, what's the word, like at a peak state or not, or you feel energetic or you feel whatever kind of goes along with not feeling like confident specifically about a task, but feeling like more ready to be confident, right? It's peak state or confident. You're like walking tall and all that. Then that will give you a context where it's more likely that you'll interpret stuff that you see on the surface and your past history and so forth, it's more likely that you'll have a feeling like you'll succeed if you have that mindset, but it's not nearly foundational. And so it seems like great advice because it's better wisdom in this world that I'm describing, or this kind of limited understanding of the world that I'm describing. It's very normal and overwhelmingly involves the idea of stepping back a few frames or intervening contextually, like with mindset, treating a religious revelatory text, right, as if it's fully foundational, that we don't need to think about how we might know whether, like, how and what is true or whether or not that particular text is one we should pick, how to go about applying it and so forth would be more deep, more meta, right? That we would have to use frames like that in order to understand some kind of revelatory text, right? Religious text. Or so people come up with things that are foundational and they'll try to come relating to what Megan was asking about. They'll be jockeying to try to make the standards that they're focused on and they feel like they're good at the foundational standards, where literally people will feel like fashion is like the foundation. It might sound ridiculous, but there's people that really think and act this way, where they really judge people based on things like that and themselves. So it all comes down to this kind of really getting immersed in ways to really believe that you're standing in the right place. Since there's no such thing as real understanding when it comes to that, it comes down to this kind of what amounts to hysteria, to the life really becomes about. When I talk about proving that you're already awesome, this is what I'm referring to. It has to do with people don't think they're standing on anything. It's almost like the buck stops with them, right? Like their ego, their self. And so they have to be good enough because they're like the foundation, right? But yourself just came from, I talked about this, it came from where? Like you're a 1 year old and you had an epistemology, which means you had a way of developing a sense of the world, what was going on and what's true and what's important and how to think. And it started when you were like an infant and it just kept on accumulating from there, but it never got revamped from there. So you're still running on the same basic engine that you were born with and that you're using by instinct and such when you were one. Whatever wisdom you had at one, there's been no fundamental change, except, of course, with you guys working on things with law implications. But typically with people, and we've absorbed this, what I'm describing as the default as normal, it's so powerfully in every message from people all over the place. So much is built on this and culture and expectations and the way people interact with you in so many subtle ways is all based on that understanding of the world, where it's like something like you and your standards and norms and such is as far as people can get. And so they need to convince themselves that those are correct by being as biased as possible, basically. Like the only way to convince yourself that you're already standing in the right place is if we take a look at this, if we go back to my basic frame mental picture here, where there's a succession of these frames and you're standing on say frame number 3, if the most outer frame is frame number 1, and there's a frame inside of it, number 2. There's a frame inside of that, number 3. What was I saying here about standards and norms and you feeling awesome? So now let's picture that the frames that let's imagine now that like lots of people where there's a whole bunch of iterations of repeats of this picture, this mental picture of succession of frames. Suppose each person has one. All right. So each person has a succession of frames and they're standing somewhere and they don't know what they're standing on. They can't see it and they can only look inside of where they're standing. And if there's a ton of errors with the frame, especially with the outer ones, right, that then cause skewing of a misperception about things people see inside the frames as well. So the outer frames have errors in them that are causing all sorts of ripple effect problems and anxieties, lack of confidence, bad decisions, missed opportunities, bad conclusions about things, negative emotions that are not just, don't just feel bad, but lead to bad reactions and responses, senses of what's important, bad priorities and such. A lack of enjoyment of the good things someone has, all that sort of stuff, which leads to less accumulation of those things, right? And so forth. So imagine now there's all these flaws, but people can't see, not only can people not see the flaws, they don't see the frame in the first place that they're standing on or the frames outside of that. They don't understand the existence of those frames. But they're flawed. But then they're desperately trying to believe that everything's okay, right? They don't think of it in terms of my outer frames that I'm standing on or the frames outside of those. I want to prove those are okay. They think of it just as I'm okay as a person. I'm not so bad or I'm good and everything's going to be basically okay, right? Now, people need to redefine basically okay to something pretty crappy, as I pointed out with people's idea of living their lives and winning. Not really, they don't think of it as winning or not, but people's overall goal in their lives of trying to leave the world, say, a better place is insane. It's pathetic, right? If you look at people's typical view of a successful life, it ends and there's all sorts of suffering still in the world. They don't picture that suffering. They picture people being better off, but implicit within what's really going on when someone imagines that they've led a successful life is there's all sorts of suffering left in the world, which is obviously a loss, right? It's obviously a really crappy outcome. If there's massive suffering, even if I've improved the lives of 1 billion people, if there's tremendous suffering in the lives of 3 billion and a bunch of suffering in the lives of 2 billion, and I say, that's what I want. Yeah, that's great. That means you actually want the suffering of 5 billion people and intense suffering of however many people. And I don't mean every single moment of the day, but there's lots of it, right? And you literally want that if you picture a successful life. Now, a lot of you guys have figured out because of what we've discussed, you've changed your understanding on it, and you understand a win to be different than massive, intense suffering of billions of people is not a win. And that makes perfect sense once you know how to look at it. But that thought just doesn't occur to people, which is shocking. And what's shocking is not like we could maybe grasp that it doesn't occur to some people, but the fact that it pretty much universally doesn't occur to people is fairly shocking, right? Because it's pretty simple once it's pointed out, but the distinction doesn't come across people's minds in a way that they grasp it for some reason in typical life. Do you guys, by the way, do you guys grasp that idea about what I mean by a win and how it's a loss to have billions of people suffering, and how normally if people think of what a successful life would look like for themselves outside of LOI, then it entails massive suffering for billions of people at the end of it. Not because of that person, but it still happens. And people call that a success. Full win. Exactly. Lauren says something insightful here. He says, I'm starting to appreciate the dilemma you're in here. And that you guys are in. A lot of you guys, hey, Sullivan and Faith. I started watching your video, Faith. I look forward to finishing it. It's very cool concept. Lawrence says, I'm starting to appreciate the dilemma you're in and that we're in right here. Trying to explain something to people they're not even aware of and don't want to question. Absolutely. That's my puzzle that I've been working on for years. I've certainly been working on the puzzle of understanding law of application and related things itself. But then a lot of it is trying to figure out how to address a question, to give people an answer to something before they have the question, which is why I do a lot of helping to build up the question with you guys as well. But terrific comment, Lawrence. Normal idea of success is way off. Yes, shocking when you first heard of it. Yes, that's why you can't drink margarita. You happen to me in fact. Right. I point out that it's not that I am looking to do this or not, like personally, but not a win until it happens. And so if someone else takes care of it or several people, then great, then I can drink margaritas on the beach. My goal is not to teach LOI. My goal is to be done explaining it. Kind of like my goal with money wasn't to make it, but to be done making it ultimately, or my at least the end. That's good give there, Mike. Massive worldwide endless needless sufferings. Crappy. Thank you, Mike. Very succinct. Faith has a smile, cleanup crew getting it. Understood it. Think of how good things would be for everyone yourself. I agree. No, it'll be wonderful. I'll really enjoy those margaritas when everyone's happy. Exactly right. Or not unhappy. Good. So we have this succession of frames, right? And one of the big revelations or distinctions that I've referred to in different ways in the past, but that's encapsulated or illustrated in this mental picture is how people don't see where they're standing, what's underneath it, And then practically, if we think logically about how people will act, given that's the case, then like so much of social conversation or discourse about intercourse, it's social discourse aspect is social discourse is like about who's like more offended, right? And so forth. There's, in other words, if there's no sense of what's true, then people come up with substitutes that are ridiculous, what you could compare them with what actually makes sense, instead of discussing whether an idea is true. It's who's more like offended, who's more upset, that sort of thing. And if someone starts getting offended or upset, that means you're wrong. And whoever can get more offended, upset, and make them right, and things like that. And if someone's operating on that level and you try to talk about what's correct and get there, they'll just tend to get upset and get a headache in many cases. And of course, there's exceptions. There's plenty of people, when they get a glimpse of this, they chase after it, like they want to understand this. So it's not all dismal at all. And we'll get those people, and then we'll keep getting people on to be like gravity, where the more people understand this, then the more additional people will be able to understand it. Jennifer wrote, as I re-listened to Alchemy 26 yesterday, it hit me, there was 30 of those total. It hit me how massively different the understanding of good and bad as opposites on a continuum compared to good. Yeah, what Jennifer's saying will be hard to follow in a vacuum, but if you already understand it, then you'll recognize it, and it'll be excellent. About how I talk about how I won't get on the track right now, but yeah, that good and bad are not, they're on different sliding bars. They're not just, it's not just one bar where it goes up and down, good and bad. And if you don't understand that now, then figuring that out or asking me or having me talk about it at a different time would be very critical. The practical, even though it might be hard to understand if you've never heard that before, and just based on a quick blurb, it's very impactful. Mike agrees with the offended thing. Okay. And now mostly talk about this to bring some things home regarding confidence and so forth. The offended picture. All right. So bringing it to what what Cruz wrote, when it comes to confidence, what we want to be able to do is understand, and then understand why it's wrong, the kind of typical default method of gaining confidence. If you just supposedly understand the correct answer, you're not really going to understand it if you don't, about confidence. If you don't see the distinction with how it's normally done and why that's wrong. And I've already begun or even almost finished for some of you describing the wrong way to go about confidence. If you're standing on a flawed frame, and you don't know that even is going on, and that frame affects your perception of what you're looking at, like event and sales interactions you've had with business owners and so forth. The frame that you're standing on is affecting what you're seeing from that. It's affecting how you go about learning how to rank websites. It affects how you interpret communications from your family about your overall career. There's all kinds of assumptions. Some of them, again, are potentially visible, because remember what I described with the succession of frames is that if you're standing, let's say, on frame number 3, and there's 10 levels of frames, and level 10 of the frames is the most surface stuff, the stuff that you feel like you're or wherever that's obvious to you, then that's what, that I just said, that's what you're potentially able, without like law of implication and such, you're able to step back from the surface stuff that you see and think about your mindset, or think about your preparation, think about sales in general, where you're thinking back from the specific experiences and observations and how things seem on the surface. You're able to do that without getting all the way to like law of implication type thing. And that's what but even that takes like an intentional kind of zooming out. Doing that will build confidence, of course. The more context that you accumulate, and the more you have a sense of the idea of stepping back and accumulating context, such as understanding more about sales, understanding more about people, understanding more about yourself, like yourself in a normal way. But ultimately, it's going to, without law of implication type thinking, and without what I'm trying to explain to you, I am explaining to you, so you'll have it. But part of what I'm explaining is to see how things normally are, because if you don't, you won't be able to see properly the right way to go about things. So I need to explain the kind of default way how things work for you to get things totally right and for you to understand how they should work right. It's all part of explaining, because I'm trying to give you a distinction. And to have distinction, you need to see both sides, right, to have the contrast. So the dilemma that people are normally, so you need to see the dilemma. And it's part of what we're saying about confidence. So that the dilemma, and this will ultimately relate to more than confidence. This is a kind of an overall critical part of the understanding law implication and all sorts of areas of success in your life and various issues and anxiety. What I'm saying relate to like a ton of stuff that goes on with you, with everyone. And as we develop what I'm talking about, then you'll have it as a tool to explain. A lot of you are at the point where you also are looking to explain this to other people. And as you work with this and I work with it and I continue with this webinar, then this will give us a tool to explain to other people as well. Of course, while we're in the middle of explaining it, it's formed, but it'll get there. All right. So to gain confidence normally, a person could step back a little bit, think about their mindset and about contextual things like learning sales, ranking websites better, showing the potential clients or business owners that they're talking to, even starting their own business, like local type business, and getting to understand more about what it's like for those people. All those contextual factors will do two things. They'll reinforce the idea of strengthening your context when it comes to confidence talking to business owners. So again, you'll reinforce the idea of developing context, plus by developing those actual contextual things like sales ability or identifying with business owners, then you will justifiably build your confidence. And because you're building your confidence, you just have more ducks in a row, more details on your side. Let me repeat one more time. You'll do two things. You'll have more details on your side and you'll have the meta process of developing contextual details on your side more practiced. And you'll feel smart that you've done that justifiably. So you'll feel extra smart. You'll feel smart because you have more details that'll help you sell. And you'll feel smart because you accumulated those details contextually. And that will build your confidence right there. And that standard, fairly wise and smart way to build confidence. And that isn't wrong, but stopping there or limiting your understanding to that will an important problem, which is, and it's essentially what I call like the mindset problem. The problem being is when people, and for some reason I think of when people use a text as foundational rather than as like raw material. Like a religious text could be perfect and still it has to be treated as raw material for you seeking understanding of it. Like something being perfect doesn't force you to know everything that's correct. As I pointed out before, if that was the case, you wouldn't need to open it or read it, or you wouldn't have to read it in your language. If it was so perfect, it would just impose understanding on you. If it was perfect in the way people treat it implicitly, right? Where if it's foundational in that way, you wouldn't need anything else. Because that's what foundational means, is that it's the bottom of things. So it would just impose you to stand on it and you're basically set. Anyhow, so there's an analogy to me between people like treating religious texts as foundational in the wrong way. Doesn't matter again. It doesn't mean it's not relevant whether they're perfect or not. Your epistemology interacts, your ability to understand and interpret interacts with a religious text regardless. And if you're imperfect, then, or if your epistemology is imperfect, then the end result of mixing it with the religious text is going to be imperfect. Similarly, I do that to help illustrate, it matters in and of itself, and then it helps illustrate about mindset and the problem with stopping there in terms of trying to find a place to stand when it comes to confidence and stuff. What when I say mindset is not foundation? You'll probably feel it in a certain way, but if you're familiar with other stuff I've talked about for a while, suppose we have issues with our view of the world so that we feel a certain sense of scarcity or, oh, here's an important one that relates to something else that's related that I wanted to mention today. Suppose that you don't realize how important the following concept is. Whether you understand time to be on your side or not. There's a critical component to both not feeling anxiety and to feeling confident that has to do with your sense of time being on your side. where time being on your side means that if you don't change course, you're going to keep being better off over time. Like you might perform. So if time is on your side, here's my kind of definition or construction of illustrating what I mean by it. You might move your body and say stuff during the course of the upcoming weeks, let's say, and months and years. But if you don't have to fundamentally change your overall frame of things, and you'll be fine. You'll be better and better off. For example, suppose that checks just came in the mail for over $10,000 month after month, and you'll only spend $5,000 a month. Then time would be on your side regarding money, right? You don't have to change anything. You still have to go physically walk to the mailbox. I understand that they can do direct deposit these days, but I'm illustrating a point here. So you walk to the mailbox, get the check, you have to go to the bank. You have to do some things, but those are things you're going to do within your frame, like they're not going to be an issue. So time is basically on your side. You still have to keep spending less than the 10,000 and so forth. But overall, those frames are already in place and what I just said. And so time's on your side. When there's a red flag or an indication that you/your mind, right? Your mind isn't configured in a way where it has integrated, but it believes that time is on your side, possibly because it's not, right? Like possibly because you have things set up where they're not, right? It's a conclusion based on other beliefs and frames and so forth that you have. So if you have various assumptions and frames and strategies and things set up wrong, such that where when your brain does the math and adds that up, time is not on your side. And you know the feeling. You wake up in the morning and you feel like if you don't do a bunch of stuff that is not in an easy flow for you, that today, that you're going to be worse off. Do you guys feel like that sometimes? Can you identify what I'm talking about? Where basically you have a sense that if you wake up in the morning or if you spend the next week only in flow, and like we often have the sense that there's a bunch of things we need to do today or this week or this month that that aren't like in flow for us, that we don't really want to do, or we don't know how to do them yet, or we need to figure it out in a way that it's not easy and I'll be in like flow. And if we don't do it, and it could be daily that you feel this way, that's common. I've lived that way plenty, right, in the past. When it pops up these days, I identify it, like I'm aware of this whole situation. And so readily identify what the issue is, right? Yeah, that sinking feeling, right? That's normally how this is the overwhelmingly common reality in people's lives, is the sense that if you don't figure out something today and do a bunch of stuff today that partially you don't really want to do, you're screwed. Like you're going to have a sinking feeling. If you just sip margaritas by the pool all day, you would be like in trouble, especially if you did that for a few days, right? It could even just be relationship wise with your family. They might feel like you neglected them, right? Whatever it is, if you feel like there's a bunch of stuff you have to do that's not totally in flow for you, then implicitly like time is against you. And that leads to anxiety and that erodes your confidence. If you're talking to a business owner, and there's a whole number of levels where you can feel like time is against you. You might feel like they're trying to exit the conversation before you might finish what you want to communicate. So time is against you. You might feel like you may not be able to fulfill what they want within the time frame. Then time is against you. You might feel like your money is running out or your confidence is running out because your confidence is based on success. And if you don't succeed, right, all these different ways where time is against you. If you don't achieve a certain result by a certain time, then you're at a disadvantage, right? So that's an example of an invisible frame that people can be standing on, and typically they are standing on, that's a flaw that no matter what your attempts at mindset are, and then no matter what your other attempts at details and ranking sites and reading sales books, you're standing on a frame like that and you're screwed. It's not that you'll never make money or never make a sale, but it's screwing with you all the time. And it's those sorts of things Lawrence referred to, right? When he said, I'm starting to see the issue. It's that stuff that I know to explain to you guys, right? But normally people don't know that there's even something there they're standing on, that there could be a flaw. They don't have the question. They don't have like a series of questions, right? They're missing. And so my answer isn't something that they're looking for at first. So I have to explain all of it. But at the point where I'm able to explain all of it and you have the question and the answer, it's amazing, right? You're like, holy cow, I didn't even know to ask that question. But now that I have the question and the answer, that's incredible, right? So time is on your side is a necessary. It's not totally sufficient. There's other ingredients, although the rest of the ingredients tend to be inevitable once you have that. I'll explain that in a sec. So again, anxiety, both anxiety on the one hand and confidence on the other hand, once you're standing on a frame that where time is on your side, which involves understanding that. And the reality is overall, fundamentally, time is on our side and everything's okay when you understand the very most outer frames in life. But it's totally crucial to get to the point to where you get that frame solid, the time is on your side. Both, and the way it works, you get it from two directions. There's the overall time is on your side fundamental that you need to understand how and why that's true. Overall, ultimately. Then what happens is, you see, we normally see, and this is not wrong. It's just the case, and but we want to have just it's not wrong how your car, as I say, goes forward the way it's going. But we need to work with that and harness it. We normally see like what's on like box level number 10, right? If the outermost frame is level 1, there's succession of frames, mindsets in the middle. And so we're constantly developing our strategies and stuff, priorities and navigation and stuff outside in. And it's not that's wrong, but what you can get is a gap. And that's another thing I wanted to tell you guys. It's part of where I'm trying to fill in some gaps that you guys are dealing with applying law of implication, right? And what I'm just describing here is going to help people see something that you've been struggling with, and mostly invisibly, but it pops up where you'll ask me questions that are solved by this ultimately. So try to picture this with me. Sorry, my nose is itching right now in continuous. If you are naturally and okay, and it's normal and okay, but you tend to see what's on the surface. And so you'll be like, all right, I'm meeting with a client. They say, yes, I need to rank websites. And then you've agreed to certain deadlines to some degree, or they have them in their mind. They want to see results by a certain time, and they're reasonable timeframes, but still you have a sense that, all right, I need to do this. And then maybe you get a bunch of clients at the same time. And now you start feeling a bit of panic, like time is against you. And that all accumulated on the surface. And overall, you might know, especially if I go over it with you now, how and why ultimately everything's okay and time is on our side. But there's a gap of frames in the middle that are ignored for the moment because you develop your situation that you're dealing with kind of on the surface. And what you need to do is connect everything up. You have to step back and see and get perspective is the general term. But with LOI, you can get perspective particularly accurately and ultimately. And you need to connect it all up and see how it all fits in. And then, if we have the outer frame clear, which I'll discuss immediately, about how everything's ultimately okay and time is on our side fundamentally, then you can always have that to step back to. Because you'll have a kind of signal or a red flag when you start to feel like time is against you. You step back to where ultimately everything's on your okay. That might not change the immediate reality of, okay, wait, I have these clients that expect this, but then you can fill in kind of intermediate frames. All right, so another person expects something from me. What's going to happen if I don't fulfill that? It's not like the end of the world. Like when you look, it's like with the fear video. If your mind is getting stuck where, oh no, then I'll let them down, or I won't keep my word, or I won't make as much money, and your mind is getting stuck there, then you just carry it through. Okay, so then what happens? If I don't hit the deadline, what happens? All right, you walk through and then you see that you deal with it, right? You work through. And so once you do that, the anxiety, if you all have the ultimate frame where you understand how ultimately everything's okay in the world and in the existence, then it's like with the fear thing where it dissolves. because you realize that time is on your side and you reframe the more specific surface mundane issue you're dealing with. Of course, you still can focus and work and try to hit a deadline and get everything accomplished. But what you you'll reframe things when you accidentally did my thing I talk about where your plan is for plan A to succeed and that's your only plan. And no plan should be plan A succeed like everything works out the way I ideally hope or else, right? That's not a plan. That's silliness, right? A good plan is here's my ideal and my best guess on how to reach it. I'd like to rank these, get a certain number of keywords ranked at a certain height for these clients over 6 months. But then it should be, and here's how I'm going to go about it generally or specifically. And if I don't, here's what I'll do. And here's how I'll feel. And so you have what happens if plan A succeeds ideally, and then what you'll do otherwise. And what you do otherwise can be simple in general, like I've talked about in the past. I said it particularly well on one webinar recently. I don't have that at the tip of my tongue, but the gist of it, because I lived this, so I'm speaking from my life and experience and I understand it, but I don't know that I'll say it as perfectly. But the gist of it is, like basically at that point, be closer to the situation. I'll have the experience of what I've done trying to hit plan A ideally. If I don't hit it, then I'll go from there. I'll have more raw material for understanding that I can convert into actual understanding to some degree. And then I'll reassess and come up with a new plan, a new ideal going forward from there. And I'll be in a better position to do that at that time or at some time in the future. Or maybe it'll be in a month from now. Even if you have a 6-month time window, in a month or 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, you'll be in a better position to reassess if you need to. Could just be in 6 months. You see? So none of your plans should ever be plan A succeeds or else just vague badness, right? That's always silly, yet very normal. That's how things work by default is people's plan is for their plan to succeed in an fairly ideal way. And that's it. And then that's the extent of their thinking. All right. So what I've said so far is that we're about to get to go back over why things are okay overall. Then we can separately understand that it's normal that we build in like tasks and projects and little to-do things on the surface, and they don't get built all the way deeply and connected up with that everything's fundamentally okay. We can get more in the habit of doing that, but it's not even necessary to do everything perfect all the time exactly. Instead, you have red flag, or what I call red flag. It's not the perfect word for it, but little indications that you need to step back to more outer frames or middle frames and get them all integrated and straight with what's ultimately going on in your life and in life. All right. And then everything's basically okay. So you don't need to obsess about getting everything right. You'll get more in the habit of generally getting things right, like not just setting yourself up for plan A succeeds or I'm miserable and confused. But then when you start to feel anxious, you know what to do, or you build to where you understand more of what I'm saying and you'll know what to do. All right. So why is everything okay fundamentally, right? Fundamentally, you are a being. You're aware of your consciousness field. You're not your body. You're not even your mind or your brain. There's somebody who created both you and your consciousness field, and your consciousness field changes. So there's somebody that is able to change your consciousness field. Your consciousness field changes what you experience as the world continuing, right? But what you're aware of changes, but it changes in a flow that makes a lot of sense. We could say that it's state dependent, which means that each moment is related to the previous one in a way that makes sense. Now, not in a way that we perfectly predict at all. We make all kinds of errors with predicting what's going to happen and expectations and extrapolations, but we make errors, but there's a whole ton of ways that obviously the world flows and makes sense. Right? We just take it for granted. It's so overwhelmingly true that it's just part of the experience. What the world would look like if it was not state dependent would be that each moment would have absolutely no connection to the next. It would just be utter chaos. You couldn't have any memories. You couldn't have any reasons for the thing. If you remember someone punched you in the face, it could have nothing to do with them actually punching you in the face because no moment depends on the next. Everything is totally disconnected and chaotic. That is totally not the way things are. So that means that there is something and someone, basically. It's something, but that something has to be a someone, something aware, because there's something and then someone that is able to both make your conscious field and make it make sense and make it be based on reason that flows. So we're now talking about a thing that's aware because it's aware of your conscious field, not, and then it's aware of reasons why your conscious field should be the way it is, and then the way it is the next moment. So we're talking about something bordering on omniscient and omnipotent, and then it turns out that that person, God, right, is actually is omnipotent, omniscient. That has to do with infinity and understanding unlimited, what it means to be unlimited, how there's no such thing as an unlimited amount. There's no such thing as anything actually exists that's also infinite. So the string of whole numbers, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? The set of whole numbers, it's unbounded, it's unlimited, right? You can keep adding another whole number. What can't exist is all the whole numbers written down on a piece of paper or in the stars or in God's mind. So even God cannot, God's mind could be unlimited, just like the set of whole numbers, and that it can always hold another number. But God cannot actually picture all the whole numbers. Not even God can do that. And that's not a guess. That's certain because there's no such thing. Just like God can't actually make a married bachelor, a person who's both married and not married at the same time, because those words don't refer to anything. It's an internally contradictory statement. It doesn't refer to a thing. It refers to no thing, nothing. The idea of an unlimited amount, like an unlimited thing actually existing, like all the whole numbers being written out. That phrase, that concept is internally contradictory, refers to nothing. So God can't do or make an internally contradictory concept real, right? That's not a limit on God's power. It's just inherent within logic. So God can't make contradictions true or both sides of a contradiction at the same time in the same relationship because there is no such thing. All right. So God can be and have to be unlimited. Now you can say, well, maybe God could be limited, but then what would be limiting God? Someone or group of things, right? Has the power. Let's just take your conscious field in a vacuum, forget about everyone else's. Something has the power to make and continue to make your conscious field, right? So now either it's not no one, right? Not nothing that's making your conscious field. It has to be something. So there's either one something or a bunch of taken collectively, first of all. Let's say there's 10 somethings, pick a number, that are making your conscious field. And only 10. I'm just for the sake of illustrating a point here. There aren't, but I'm just saying, let's suppose there's 10. No, so there can't be an unlimited number. There can't actually be an infinite number. There has to be some finite number of actual anything, numbers that are currently listed somewhere, or beings of any sort, molecules, whatever. Whatever actually exists can't be. It can be unbounded in the sense that more could potentially exist, but no infinite amount of anything actually, including gods. So if there's more than one God, which there isn't, but I'm explaining why that is, but I'm looking at possibilities here for a second to cross them off. So if there was a bunch of gods, there could not be an infinite amount no matter what, just like there can't be an infinite amount of anything. So there has to be a finite amount. So let's say there's 10, for example, and the same logic will apply to any multiple number. But if there's 10, then taken collectively, can the power of those gods to affect your conscious field be limited? No, because there's no other gods. I said there were 10, right? And there's not infinite. So whatever number you pick, that's the number. And that's the entirety of all the gods. And so taken as a whole, nothing else can be existing to limit them. So their power collectively would not be limited. So now the question is, are there a bunch of them who collectively are unlimited somehow? Right? One way or the other, the group or one are unlimited in their power. Unlimited means there's no actual other thing that actually exists and is limiting the power of God or gods to make and affect your consciousness. Now, suppose there was like 10 of them. Now, what if they disagreed? Remember, as a whole, their power is unlimited. So if there's more than one, and if they disagree, then you're going to find out which one's more powerful because one of them's going to win out. And so that one is more powerful, and that one's power can't be limited, right? Whatever the most powerful one is, that one's power can't be limited. So that one has unlimited power, which would mean that the other ones actually don't have any power. So it collapses. You could think it through yourself. And it's also not a big burning question. Are there 12 gods or there one? So there's only going to be one God with unlimited power. And then any other theoretical God doesn't make any sense because that God power would be limited by the unlimited one, and then it would collapse to being irrelevant. If you had two gods, one who had unlimited power and one who had limited power, then the one with limited power makes no sense, all this, right? Because the one that's limited would be fully limited by the omnipotent one. So it would just be, he would be fully like a robot. Now you could say, what if God, the all powerful God, created like a sub God and gave that God free will? That's a misunderstanding of free will. The omnipotent God couldn't create another God that was omnipotent. Because again, the minute they disagreed, we'd find out which one was truly omnipotent and which one wasn't. The omnipotent God could potentially make some sub God and put boundaries, say, all right, you have free will within these boundaries. But God couldn't make a sub God that had unlimited power. God could only make a sub God that had limited power, at which point it's not really relevant to think about it anymore because God's still dictating the boundaries. And so what matters is there's still one God who is all powerful, and that fundamentally. And of course, there's other stuff that exists besides God, like us and whatever else. But I'm talking about God now. And so if God created a sub God, that wouldn't be God in the sense of one all powerful in the sense of not being limited. The knowledge of the real God couldn't be limited either. So unlimited knowledge and intelligence. That does not, however, many people think that God can be aware of an infinite number of things. And no, even the omnipotent, all-knowing God is not aware of an unlimited number. In other words, and this is going to matter a lot, I'll point out in a number of ways, that confusion. So God's mind can be infinite, and the idea that we can't understand God is nonsense. You don't have to understand everything about God to understand something about God. And there's critical things about God that we can't understand. And nothing of what I'm saying, label religion or the box or the frame of religion is irrelevant to what I'm saying. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about what is, right? I'm building off of the fact that we're aware of stuff. That's foundational, right? So there's no category that can marginalize what I'm saying. What I'm talking about here is fundamental to understanding what's going on in the world. And it's fundamental to your anxiety. It's fundamental to your confidence. Without understanding this, then you're constantly making up for being in the wrong frame that's wobbly and confusing. If you can't understand that everything's okay, then you basically can't really function properly. You just have to have a substitute, a cheap substitute for functioning. And your way of building confidence is just going to be biased and fraught with error. Okay. And nothing of what I'm talking about is opinion. Nothing is based on a particular revelatory text or whatever. It's just necessarily true. So God cannot be aware of an actual infinite number of things, which means that to the extent that the future has unlimited possibilities, God is not aware. So God can decide, I'm going to do the following things for sure. God can say that people only have free will within certain boundaries. And any way that God can make the future not infinite, then God can be aware. But within any boundaries where it's infinite, then God wouldn't be aware because there's no such thing as being aware of an infinite number of things. There's no being or power or blind spot that's limiting God's awareness. The future doesn't actually exist. There's a concept that's intelligible about the future, but it doesn't exist in the sense of God being able to be aware or anyone being able to be aware. Okay. But again, God could know and decide that, okay, these following things are going to happen in the future. or these boundaries on reality and stuff. One thing that people overlook is God can't be whimsical. We're so used to ignoring the frame that we're standing on and basically thinking in an arbitrary way while pretending not to, that people think God can do the same thing, but God can't be arbitrary, as a side note. And that'll come into play in various things too. But I'm sticking to trying to explain why everything's okay fundamentally, which again, you need in order to assure yourself of not feeling anxiety and to be able to connect up to more mundane things that you're working on. You have to be able to step back to what I'm saying now and to work through things properly and set things up right. All right. So there is a God who's aware and unlimited in power and knowledge, and that God exists for sure. Furthermore, a God, since God has those qualities, God also, obviously, God can't be deceived. God can't be wrong about things that exist. All right. And God's aware of your conscious field and everyone else's, by the way, which means that God will feel what you feels. And if you make someone else suffer or whatever, even if they're a bad person, so to speak, in quotes, then God will suffer, right? Because God's aware of what they're aware of. So be aware of that. This is all necessarily true, regardless of any religion and so forth. It has nothing to do with belief, in a sense. It has nothing to do with opinion. All right. It's susceptible to you pointing out where there's some kind of flaw in what I'm saying, but that's it. It can't be marginalized. You have to show. All right. So I'm not arrogant about it. But if I add 2 plus 3 and 5, and someone says, okay, that's your religion, I have a different religion, or that's your opinion, it's not my opinion. Maybe my math is wrong, so you can address on the level of my math and show me why I'm doing the addition wrong. But you can't just otherwise marginalize what I'm saying. You see what I'm saying? And someone also likewise can't do it to you if you're going through this. Right? You can get math wrong, but it's not an opinion. And it can only be addressed to the level of correcting your math, not someone just saying, well, I have a different opinion. All right. So God is aware, can't be deceived. God wants you, obviously, to feel good, to have a good value of your experience, right? You have a variable value of your experience, obviously, or you couldn't even tell what good and bad meant at all. People, of course, are confused about the actual real meaning of good and bad because our brain tries to process it and our brain itself is not conscious. And so, but you couldn't even begin to conceive of it, and you can. You obviously have better potential for better and worse value of your experience, right? Like your feeling good is distinguishable from feeling not as good, and also feeling bad. Obviously, our whole lives are based on trying to feel more good and less bad, right? For real reasons, and correctly. So both you and God want you to have more good, the value of your experience, right? Whatever you call it. They want it to be good and more good and not have bad. Since we do experience some bad, there must be a greater reason for it, which of course relates to free will and abundance that I've described before, where in order to have people experience the abundant potential from caring about others, we need to be able to act on caring for others, which means we need to be able to act, which has to do with free will. We need to have some basis for acting, some ability to, some seat or channel of free will, something we can do. And so the whole world out there, all the rules and physical rules and the reasons and the universe and all that, it's all to give us framework or playground or backdrop or whatever context, which make free will possible. If there was no regularity to things, there was no way, right? If there wasn't a sensibility and a state dependent, like I said, if we didn't have some sense of reasons why things turn out one way rather than the other, and why people can feel better rather than worse, we couldn't have any free will. So we certainly have a limited understanding, right? But we neither have no understanding nor are we omniscient. We can be deceived, but we can also make sense out of the world, obviously, to some degree. And there's some channel or place for our free will in there. So we have the capacity to care about others and ourselves and love and care about God. God is not deceived at all. So God definitely wants, as I said, you to have all good and no, but that would be dependent on us exercising our free will, of course, in a continuous manner. And what that's ultimately going to do is dissolve contradiction in our mind and get things straight. We're obviously created with a default drive that will just keep things going, keep us alive and the species alive, so to speak, to give us a context again to exercise free will. We're programmed to survive and reproduce and so, right, and to care for our offspring and all that. But that doesn't determine what we should do. It just provides a potential backdrop. What we should do is seek understanding, dissolve contradictions, care about ourselves and others, and so forth. Now, the only reason there would be bad and is as a potentiality that gets actualized by us not exercising our free will. But another reason why there's bad, the fact that there's bad means that there's this great potential. So things can and will be even better than pure bliss because God fully could have created us in a state of pure bliss, all of us, right? Like what would amount to be like a drug-induced haze, you can picture it as, where we just feel blissful, and that continues indefinitely, where we don't starve or anything. We just keep on existing and feeling bliss. The only way God could do that, though, that's mutually exclusive with having free will. And so God, who's not deceived, remember, so God obviously picked correctly. So we can reason backwards from that in a moment. We're in a situation even better than perpetual endless bliss. Think about it. That's necessarily true. However, currently it's not better than that, right, in a sense. But ultimately it is. And so the only reason why things would be bad now is because we're in a situation where we have the potential for something better than this bliss. And God is obviously interested in keeping things going until we get it right. And especially if there's anyone who's specifically focused on that, then it's even more kind of obvious, likely, however you want to get to. At this point, there's maybe a slight amount of conjecture, but not really, where if we're looking to get things right, then God's going to give us time for that. That's the whole point of everything. God's already giving us time. And so if we're obviously distinctly working on it, which people mostly haven't done before, but if we're working on it, on getting things right, getting contradictions dissolved, seeking to understand how to understand and so forth, then that's exactly what we're supposed to do. And it leads to something better than endless bliss, because God could have done that again and didn't. So that means there's a potential for something even better, which is all part of God's plan. And we're not our bodies. So God could just permanently annihilate us after we die, but there's no real point to that. Like that it really doesn't really make any sense, right? Compared to us continuing on. Whatever God does, it'll be best anyway. But it's hard to imagine how it could be best for us just to be annihilated versus get to what the whole point of God creating us is, to get to a state that's even better than like a drug-induced haze, one where we have the benefit of the happiness and pleasure, but where we also can love and have done something and have participated in that, right? So literally better than like a drug-induced haze, but then like a one where our bodies don't wither and so forth. So that's why we're made, for that reason. And it must be possible in where we're headed if we choose, but we have to choose it, right? By seeking it. And so we're only going to gain an understanding as we seek it. And so time, and that's all that's fundamentally going on. That's all that really matters. And that's what's going on, period. That's basically, I can only repeat myself. That is what's going on. The rest of it is just kind of details and noise. As a practical matter, we act as if we need money, and and food and stuff like that. But and remember, we have a whole backdrop that we get to participate in stuff, right? We don't just sit there like a bump on a log. Doing actions, accumulating money, giving people massages, interacting socially, making video games, playing video games, all the good things in life, making art, poetry, reading books, writing books. All of that is participating in the world God created. It's all a ripple effect of exercising our free will and caring about others. And so even being, I say this kind of tongue in cheek, like being fully enlightened, you'd still be creating what amounts to art And making an iPhone for people to use could be like, it's all, and I mean, it is in a sense, like it could be whatever, making food, whatever it might be. There could be commerce, potentially, whatever. There's nothing wrong or right about money. It's just an efficient way to communicate and store value and so forth. As a practical matter, since we behave like we need it, we might as well get it straight, things like that. And then, but when we see that what's fundamentally going on is we seek and then gain understanding. And that leads to a state better than bliss, or else God would have already created it. And then you can put everything else in context. And then you still want to fulfill your contracts and make money. But when it's framed when you can step back to this frame and understand basic strategy of alternative use of resources, priorities, and that you set up your plans so that you come up with targets that you can reasonably hit. When there's another person involved, then understandably there's deadlines. Even if I'm gonna go meet someone, if I'm gonna eat lunch with another person, then we have to come up with a time that we're going to intersect and meet at it, and that makes sense, right? You can't avoid that. Therefore, there's a bit of a deadline, a bit of a time crunch as soon as someone else is involved, because you're trying to intersect with that person. So it's perfectly reasonable that when you take on a task, you have a time frame for it. But what you don't do is have a situation, or what isn't wise is to have a situation where there's Armageddon if the time frame isn't met, right? Just if you make a lunch date, you generally want to keep it, and it's a priority within certain boundaries, as long as your kid isn't like bleeding, you have to take them to the hospital, whatever, certain boundaries. And if something happens outside of those boundaries, like your kid has an emergency, then we understand, and you can name those or not, right? Obviously, culturally, you don't like name every boundary or the exact boundary, but you can vaguely say, "Yeah, absolutely, unless there's an emergency, it's a priority." But if I see that my favorite store has a sale, that doesn't mean I shouldn't show up for or on time for lunch. That might be not outside the boundaries. You get a sense of boundaries when you're intersecting with someone else. But once you learn to think that way, then you're going to make an agreement you have with someone else a priority within certain boundaries. And as long as you do that, then if you hit the deadline, good. And you try to guess a good deadline that's reasonable. And if you don't, then you have a plan for that. So it involves boundaries and what's going to happen if you don't hit your ideal within the time frame, whether it's meeting someone for lunch or ranking websites, whatever. And so everything can be within this successive context of frames that you can get right. You can have a sense of how to live your life and how to deal with things and how to deal with other people and the necessary deadlines and intersections that you're going to have with them and what to do when sometimes things are going to happen that are unpredictable or outside of reasonable boundaries for what's a priority, where you still meet the person on time versus when you don't, or when you still fulfill the contract in the time frame that you guys hope for when you don't. You try to work that in as best you can. And then there's always going to be things you don't guess or gray areas or things that come up, and then you deal with them as you gain understanding about that. Things continue. But when you see things deeply that way, and then I gave you some mid-level strategy of making sure you're how to look at contracts and deadlines and plan A and plan what to do if you don't hit it and so forth. When you have that understanding, then you can consistently have time on your side or realize when it got off by accident of that and get things back on track where you understand you have things framed. You can always reframe things more accurately so that time is on your side. When it feels like time is not on your side, then you have an error in your frames and you can reframe things. And it might involve communicating with someone else and reframing your communication with someone as best you can. And you could say, what if they don't agree that they're fair, right? Ultimately, if you can't hit a deadline or you can't accomplish something, you can't accomplish. The world doesn't end. And so you can plan for yourself, not for someone else. Your happiness can't ultimately depend on other people screwing up, right? If someone violates you, then there's an issue there, but then you still try to minimize it. When I talk about property rights violations, I'm talking about using it to help yourself, not as an excuse to get all upset in your head and escalate necessarily, right? And that sort of, it's not like a when to go to pieces. It's not like my property rights stuff about being violated and what that means and violating others is like an instruction manual on how to get even more upset about a violation. That's the opposite of what I mean, right? It just helps you to understand things and so forth. And because we want to ultimately LOI it's structured so that it's a set of ideas that kind of for core principles, right? A core set of ideas that all relate logically that we want in everyone's mind. And so the perfection is achieved when more people get it and when everyone gets it. And the reason why it can work is because when you see it, you don't go back because it's not, you're standing on something solid. So it's not going to waver. Once someone gets LOI, to be simplistic in naming it, and you're not going to go backwards. So we're only going to make progress, not regress. The property rights thing is good because as it catches on with each individual, we're better off. That's why I'm clear about it. Plus, it keeps you from, it's a nice boundary for yourself. We normally have all of these moral feelings of what we're supposed to do that feed merely not violating people's property rights. And of course, just caring about people too is a separate thing. But it also allows you to clear out a lot of feelings of obligation and confusion about how you should feel. Okay, good. So that helps explain some important, I think, a number of questions people have. There's more. Oh, let me round off by saying this. So when it comes to confidence, there's two sides to it. There's getting your outer frames right, the frame you're standing on, your assumptions that you're bringing into things, your overall idea of life, your sense of scarcity versus abundance, but especially time being on your side. And again, the idea of time being on your side is not even a foundational frame. It's built off of understanding about God and yourself and what's going on with your consciousness field and value of your experience and all that. All right. So those are the most fundamental frames about God and self and who you are. And then from that, once we're standing on that, we can see about time being on our side. And then once we can see that, then we're in the ball game, or we're standing in the right place and not in the wrong place that people normally are. And we're able to build confidence in a different way. Then we can see about seeking understanding, the idea about accumulating more sense of frames and context of things, right? All the way back to how it relates to the most outer frame. Confident and also building midway down to basic strategy about your plans and how you don't accidentally plan for plan A to succeed or else who knows, it's just bad. You know how when you're little and your mom could be like, I'm not indicting all moms here or anything or women, but where they're like, you do that or else, right? And that's it, just a vague threat. But that sort of thing is how we tend to think about a lot of stuff by accident without realizing is, well, man, I got to accomplish this or else. And we may or may not put those words to it, but functionally, implicitly speaking, that's how we feel, right? We got to do it. And there's just this vague sense of badness if we don't. You never want that. You always need to have specificity about what happens. And the specificity, again, can be simple. And if I don't hit the ideal plan A, then I'll be in a position to assess how I'll proceed from there. Then that's good. So when you have that overall sense of framing, that's half of confidence, but it's a very important and powerful half. And then you have an overall confidence that if you focus and prioritize a particular skill or task or accomplishment or mastery or whatever it is, topic in life, area of life, then you can master it. However, it will still take prioritization within boundaries, which amounts to focus and so forth. Once you actually then focus, you're going to accumulate details, right? Such as about selling business owners on SEO service, which can involve the details of actually ranking sites for yourself. You have the details of how to do it and that you've done it, details about how business owners think, what they're interested in, what their objections are, what their budgets are, blah, 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 about sales, details about that. So you accumulate details and those details, and I've talked about how framework builds. Once you realize it'll build, you get out of your own way and you let your mind build a framework for you, in a sense, for itself. But it mostly happens that you having to consciously do something you don't really want to do, or you just need to not have a block. So the framework will build, and that's the other half of confidence, which is fairly obvious, but I want to point it out so we see the whole picture with confidence. So you have because I understand the outer frames I've talked about, including the basic strategy of not having plan A or L thinking, then I'm generally confident as an overall general sense of confidence. But then confidence regarding a specific accomplishment, I know that will take focus and prioritization, which I may or may not be willing and want to do, depending on thought, right? Something might not be a priority that I judge as a priority. In that way, I'm not confident that I can accomplish a certain thing in a certain time frame. I'm not going to prioritize. So the other half of it is within prioritizing. And so it begins with that you'll prioritize it. and then actually prioritizing it long enough that you accumulate the framework. And that's the whole picture of confidence. The whole picture of anxiety is even simpler, right? It's just being able to step back to where you understand and not just understand, but are able to reframe. You might have to readjust some of your middle frames that you had that got set by default. So you're not anxious because an anxiety comes from reframing things, but so they're more correct so that time is on your side. And I've just explained that about your anxiety will disappear once you go through thinking about your particular tasks and just, okay, what am I going to do if I don't hit them by the deadline? Or if it doesn't work out ideally, then I'll be in a position to reassess. What other contextual things can I do to help myself? Things like that. But then with an overall understanding that when you have it planned right, and there's always a way to plan things so time is on your side, since time is fine my way. As long as you're willing to say, I might not hit my ideal by a certain time. That's part of time being on your side is letting go from this artificial thing that you don't need. And it's basically contradictory and it's silly, right? To be like, I hit plan A or L. So there's how to dissolve anxiety and how to build confidence fully. Remember that the full confidence involves actually prioritizing something. And it's perfectly okay to not be confident about something that you're not willing to prioritize. You can be confident that at some point in the future, once you clear other priorities, you'll prioritize it and then you'll be good at or accomplish it or whatever it is. Okay, how's that, guys? Let me just get my drink out of the, not out, a smoothie with some caffeine and ginseng and so forth in it out of the fridge, and then I'll be right back. Great. It looks like Lawrence has a question here. I'll take a look at in a moment. Very clear. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And I was excited for today because of this. And it's totally normal for this to be a process. I don't think that just because I said what I said, that everything's understood and integrated. But I think there's a lot of light to come from what I said today. Okay. Take a look at what Lauren said. Lauren said, "Could you explain further why someone has to be creating our consciousness field and why it can't be random or coincidental?" All right. All right. The basic thing is the opposite of that someone's making is that your consciousness field, including the current configuration of it and every future configuration and past configuration, happens for no reason whatsoever. And you can't act on that for a moment. If we think about what it would mean for every instance of your consciousness field to happen for no reason, first of all, there couldn't be any reason why, but since there's no reason why one moment would be connected. So state dependence, your sense of state dependence is of course happening for no reason, if that's the case, right? Everything happens for no reason, if that's the case. I'll also cover maybe some things happen for no reason and some for a reason in a moment. But first, let's take a look at everything happens, meaning every configuration of your consciousness field, everything you're aware of. We're taking a look at the following proposition. It all happens for no reason. All right. That means that there's no state dependence. There's no state dependence means the reason why your consciousness field is the way it is related to the way it was. There might be other reasons like from the external world, but basically it's related to the state before it, right? We take that so for granted, it underlies everything. There would be no sense to anything without state dependence, right? There was no connection between one moment and the next whatsoever. Then again, we can't even think like that for a moment. It would mean that the fact that you have a memory that there's been a webinar is completely arbitrary. It has no connection to whether there actually was a webinar. It totally, and then this next moment that you're having that thought, it's not connected to anything previous. And that none of what happened in the past is connected to what you think happened in the past. Your memory of what happened in the past is totally arbitrary. It has nothing to do with what actually happened in the past. Whether there's a past at all there's no reason why there is a past. You could only exist for the split second. And there's no reason to think otherwise because there's no reason. And again, it fails my punch in the face test, right? If this was true, someone could walk up and punch you in the face and you could make no objection because even your sense that someone punched you in the face is not connected to them actually punching you in the face. It's not connected to it actually happening because you're remembering it happening a moment ago. And the fact that your nose hurts has nothing to do with anything, right? Because there's no reason for anything, no connection between anything, no nothing. So trying to even think along those lines is nonsensical at every turn. And so it's obviously ridiculous. And you couldn't live like that for a moment, right? You couldn't make money because there'd be no reason to make money. There'd be no reason why money means anything. There'd be no reason to think that the English language refers to anything. There'd be no reason to think that your words have any connection to any meaning whatsoever. There'd be no reason to take any action. No reason to think that when you took money to a grocery store, that they'd react to that. There's no reason to think there's a grocery store at all. There's no reason to think that you should eat food or that food exists, because all of your thoughts exist for no reason. All of your memories and beliefs have no reason or basis, right? So once again, it's totally absurd in every level and everywhere for there to be no reason. So there must be a reason. Once there's a reason for your consciousness field, then we can develop trait that reason must have. And it turns out that as we develop that, we're going to see that we need to make a distinction between a cause and a reason. A cause would have to be something that can create. A reason is a reason why something that creates the way it creates it rather than something else. So again, to just explain what I mean, I'm jumping forward I'm jumping forward in a second, although I've already explained this. God would be a cause of your consciousness field. Then we see that God would need reasons to make your consciousness field the way it was rather than a different one. And that's why we have the physical world, we have your choices, we have your mind and all that physical laws. All of those contribute and are mixed together, added together, so to speak. And the result, they're all reasons. And then they get all added together by God, so to speak. And then your conscious field is created based on that. God, again, is causal, has causal power. God can actually make a conscious field. Reasons can't do anything. Reasons are reasons why something or someone or God that can do something does them the way that God does them rather than a different way. So reasons can't create a conscious field. Chance can't create a conscious field. I'm not referring to my son. I'm referring to the concept. Chance can't make anything. It doesn't have the ability to make a conscious, right? It's just a concept. Does that help at all? Sorry, yeah, it would just be a connection thing on your end, or it could even be in the hops of the internet in between or whatever. And it might be a weakness in my connection. Great. I'm pausing to see if there's any more questions or anything. I can always end the webinar. I'm perfectly good to do that. It's been pretty successful. Alchemy bonus. Yeah, hopefully I have that posted in the various places. Yeah, I explained that stuff about God. Faith says, why God as the cause of conscious field versus something else? Okay. I didn't pull the definition of God from culture or from even the English language. I described how things have to be. And then, of course, we're going to use the word God at that point because it has qualities that overlap so strongly. What I described has to be. There has to be an entity, which is just like entity doesn't refer to anything, placeholder word. There has to be a thing that is able to make consciousness, right? And able to do all the processing necessary for the reason to make conscious fields the way they are and to keep on making your conscious field every moment. To do that thing, obviously, you need to be aware of what it's doing. And then we went into whether that thing's power, that entity's power to make your conscious field is limited or unlimited. And we understand how there has to be one being who's unlimited in power and knowledge. I then use the word God after the fact. But it's not, does that make sense? Like your question kind of dissolves because I'm not saying that God is the cause. I'm saying there is a cause with these qualities. At some point, we start to use the word God because what else am I going to call it? We call it Fred or Ooga Booga, but that would just get a little weird. Okay, great. Does anyone else marvel how fortunate we are that we have access to someone? Oh, thank you. Who can off the cuff explain correctly and factually what not us do that. I appreciate that, Janine. I tend to agree. I marvel at the fact that I'm baffled too, like even though it's me, but it's not me, right? It's my body and brain at this point and so forth. So I don't know how the heck it ended up either. And it's bizarre. It's odd too. And also I'm thankful about it that I know someone that could do humorously. The consciousness field that I embrace is rooted in scripture, which gives me confidence in knowing that I am certainly not God and I'll pretend to be. Now, confidence comes from a conscious action that makes me face my fear. God is a multidimensional life giver. Just be careful. You don't need to impose anything on what I'm saying. What I'm saying corroborate the Bible, essentially, right? But if you're unwilling to begin by putting the Bible aside, you can't corroborate it. You can't, if you make the Bible or your Christianity or your belief system foundational and then are only willing to corroborate it, from there, you can't get to where you know that God exists. You can only get to where you functionally believe that God exists, which is similar to some believing confident. And it's radically different than something much more wonderful, which is knowing that God exists. Christians, a lot of Christians use the same terminology, and a lot of them are blocked from, I'm not saying you are, but they're blocked from understanding what they can understand about God because they think it's unnecessary, because they already feel it and believe and act as if God exists. But the thing is, they act as if God exists in a sense, but they don't act like they know. And they think they act like they know. But I know what it's like to really know. And it's nothing like believing in the way that a lot of Christians functionally do. And the way that Christians believe in God rather than know is not Christian. Like it's nothing to do with actual Christianity in the sense of truth or Jesus or anything like that. It's just a cultural man-made thing. Jesus, who was it that said, normally when people think about how do you build a good house, you think of things associated with building a good house, good tools, good material. What did Jesus talk about? Build your house on a rock rather than sand. And people could say Jesus was referring to himself. There's a certain way that's true, but Jesus kept talking about seeking understanding. The one thing that Jesus criticized was hypocrisy, which had to do with contradictions. Jesus quoted scripture, but Jesus quoted the Hebrew scripture to Hebrews because they themselves affirmed that it was true and that he was pointing out contradictions between what they were affirming was true and what they were saying and thinking. People take that, I think, overly seriously in a certain way. But Jesus talked about this of looking at your foundations and seeking understanding. And it was pretty much the only thing that you just talked about once you look for it. So just be careful about making your belief system or religion foundational. What I'm saying might seem heretical, but it's a misunderstanding of what I'm saying. You can't know that Jesus is God in a circle. Like you can't witness, like Christians' ability to witness to other people, to convert other people, is very impoverished. They basically need, when you're standing on a foundation that you're trying to convince yourself is correct and it's based on belief and opinion, then you can only talk to people that are standing in the same place and have the same assumption. And you talk past everyone else. And there's a number of people that I know, as far as I can tell, they've become Christians basically because of what I explained to them that couldn't get there from what other Christians were telling them because other Christians were demanding that they feel the belief before they felt it. Like they Christians typically functionally need other people to have various assumptions already in place before they can accept Christianity. And that's unnecessary. We can get to where we can not even convince, but help clear up things for all people. And they don't have to believe or feel faith or whatever. So, I don't know how well, I don't think I'm explaining that very well, but I'm doing my best. Yeah, see, I was raised in and existed in like a Christian culture. I understand Christian culture, both the man-made and the real, the true aspect of it. And there's a real phenomenon where Christians dismiss people that don't accept Christianity as not like that they're not really seeking. But I've come across in practice, I've come across a lot of people who are genuinely seeking. And when I explain it to them properly, they embrace it right away. But they were getting told basically nonsense. There's a number of kind of man-made, I would call them, beliefs that a lot of actual Christians have that are just nonsensical. They're just wrong and contradictory. And when non-Christians spot those, they just get confused. And then Christians tell them, you just don't believe, you don't have faith. But some of again, the beliefs that Christians have, but that's not, obviously, I don't think that's part of Christianity if they're wrong. Right. So anyway, there's just an issue there. Jennifer says the traditional believing on faith is completely different and far more grounding than actually knowing because the opposite is not possible. Let me see if I can follow what you said. Did you maybe phrase something? Did you maybe switch words here in what you're saying for right? Knowing is better. Oh, far less. Got it. Got it. I see. I'll refresh. Again, I'm coming from a place like knowing it's so powerful both for myself and for people I'm talking to. Typically, the only block is people that already have a belief that they won't. I talked about this right in the last webinar. Same thing if someone like isn't willing to take a look at themselves. Like you can't know that you're a good person unless you're willing to confront that maybe you're a bad person. And it turns out that it's neither, right? That it has to do with seeking understanding, and it's not about whether you're already good or bad, right? It's not about finding whether the frames that you're standing on are good or bad. It's about getting them right, like finding what's true, not finding out whether or not where you're standing is good or bad. You're just trying to find out what's correct and stand there. Similar, but you can't to do that. You need to open up a question, and it turns out that when you open up the question, "Am I like maybe I am terribly bad?" It turns out the answer kind of again neither, and that's when you can get your frame right because you're not getting yourself like yourself is a frame. It's not you, right? Your body, your mind. It's a set of assumptions and frameworks and frame. To get it right, you have to confront that any particular idea in your mind can be wrong. To know that God exists, you have to be able to open up your mind to that God doesn't. Open up the question. And to some Christians that like heretical or nonsensical, to open up the idea of whether God exists or not, to genuinely ask the question, they almost can't understand what I'm saying. But then they're blocked. They can't get to knowing if they want to answer. Right. Mike's an example. Many Christians try to convert me. David's testimony accomplished it in a way that's just been absolutely amazing. Yeah. And there's multiple people like that where functionally that's the case. Right. Janine said, I never could just fake it until I believe like people want me to. I appreciate that. And so it isn't that I take pride in that. Like I'm not, it's hard for me to talk about Christians or Christianity this way. I know that a lot of Christians are drawn to this and that it can be a stumbling block for them when I'm talking this way, but it's necessary. And knowing it's just different. It's like with, just to make a parallel here or metaphor, I talk about, oh, so here's what this kind of helps in a certain sense explain about my views about school. So people normally think associatively. And I think about primarily where I'm standing and what I'm standing on is that has priority, right? So associatively, people think about, and this also by saying this, I'm not really talking about school, I'm talking about the concept of thinking associatively and so forth. Just using school as a template to explain some of these concepts. People think, okay, yeah, like this is helpful, that's not helpful. So like they'll think, okay, we'll help them get a career. Maybe they won't learn that fast. Maybe school is kind of inefficient. Can I teach them better at home? And they're thinking about stuff like that. The reason for me, school just was like, I know that it's off the table, like for me, because I have the luxury, by the way, again, I planned for it, but even planning for it is something you have to do in advance. So I'm not judging anyone or even strategizing about what you yourself should do. When I talk about school, I'm trying to give you understanding more about meta concepts and about school, but so you can plan and make the whatever decisions for your life based on your whole context, right? Even drugging your kid with something that sedates them, like slaves had to do that, like in the South, right? They had to pick stuff, and if their crops and if their kids were too ornery, they could really be something bad could happen. That would be even worse than their kid being sedated. And so normally you wouldn't want to sedate your kids with drugs, but if your kids are going to get killed or beaten, or you're going to get beaten where you can't support your kids are going to get separated from you if you don't, then you might have that it might be the best strategic decision to do it. Right. So there might be times when you I'm prefacing what I'm about to say about school here with I want you to understand that there might be times when something that overall tends to be very detrimental. If you had a choice, you still don't have a choice yet. Maybe you can work to it, maybe you can't. Anyway, I just want to make it abundantly clear that I'm not judging someone or even strategically dictating what someone should do. I'm just trying to give you more understanding, but especially more understanding about the the frames and method. So regarding school, when you look at where you're standing, or then that's how I look at school. And what I mean by that is for example, you have to buy into a certain type of authority and coercion that is nonsensical. Like if a kid goes to school, and what does it even mean? If I force my kid to go to school, like someone might say kids need education. Or they might say kids should have education. Should have and coercion is very different. If I say the phrase, people should experience the pleasure of sex. That's very different than saying people should be raped, coerced, forced. If I say you should rank websites, that's different than saying someone should beat you if you don't rank a website, right? Coercion, like introducing coercion to something is not the same as not doing so, right? So the idea that kids should learn or get educated or learn the basics or learn this, that, or the other thing, or prepare for college, whatever, is not the same as saying they should be coerced into it. I'm not saying that doesn't prove they shouldn't be coerced, but I'm saying it's definitely not the same thing. They're not equivalent statements. You need to justify the coercion as its own thing. You can't, you don't, coercion's never inherently justified by just saying that the result is nifty, right? Saying that sex is nice doesn't justify, obviously, coercing someone into it, right? Because then, of course, it's not nice, right? And so, and it ends up backfiring. In addition to the fact it's just immoral, it ends up backfiring, right? You coerce someone into quote unquote learning, and what you do is you teach them they don't like it. That's the tragedy of sexual abuse, which is very parallel to learning abuse. That's why I bring it up, is that it actually causes someone to have difficulties with intimacy in many cases, or most or all cases, right? It messes their ability to feel genuine, voluntary intimacy, just like cool, it's coerced learning in quotes. And I put it in quotes because and I'm sorry if it's uncomfortable for anyone, but just sexual abuse is not sex, right? Like they're related in one sense, but once you force it, it's not the same thing. And in a very practical, real way. And when you force what otherwise would be learning, it's no longer really learning in the same way, right? The experience of sexual things being forced on someone is a very different experience than voluntarily, right? In a good context. Similarly, forcing learning it's a very similar practical effect. Learning starts out as a pleasurable, exciting, natural flowing thing. And in practice for tons of people, reading, learning, and so forth, is people exhibit all the same symptoms of learning that you get from sexual abuse with sex and intimacy, right? Literally, right? That's how people's view towards learning tasks is like, oh, do I have to learn this? They actually, and kids have an excitement about learning and a curiosity. And we still do sometimes as an adult in some cases, but in a lot of cases too. But similarly, someone that's abused can still have instances where they still might be okay with intimacy, but there's a taint to it in a lot of cases too. And it's more difficult and so forth, right? And there's barriers and so forth, as I understand it. So we look at that, when we look at the frames that we're standing on versus taking associatively about school and just thinking what is school associated with. And people will think there's plus and minuses when they associate. But when you just look at where you're standing, and then furthermore, when you look at what's implied, you constantly have this time is against you thing, right? Like when you're in school, if you wake up in the morning and do nothing, you're like violating all sorts of rules, right? First of all, you're truant to school, and then you didn't do your homework, and then you can not be prepared for a test. So we maintain, again, much like sexual abuse, we maintain this anxiety for our lives in a lot of cases where people will be 40 years old and they'll have that same feeling like, oh my God, what am I missing? If I wake up this morning and I don't frantically do a number of things before the evening, I should feel anxious and bad, and I'm a bad person and I deserve kind of punishment and so forth, right? This abuse, or I don't even have to call it abuse to start with, but for some reason, people show all the symptoms of abuse without even realizing it. It's so normalized in our world that people don't recognize it as symptoms of abuse because everyone else has it. But waking up in the morning feeling like you're bad if you don't do a bunch of things, if you think about it in a vacuum, like freshly, with a fresh mind, that's like sick. Or so what if you wake up in the morning and just do whatever you feel like for the whole day? Unless you just fully run out of money, what should be the problem? Or unless you specifically promise people certain things. But why is that so hard? But people really feel panicked and like they're a bad person if they do that, especially if it's not clearly labeled vacation, which they do in school. This is vacation, it's labeled as such. Then it's okay if we put that word next to it. But outside of that, you're bad. You're truant, all kinds of things. And then on top of that, you're falling behind other people. So another thing that's implied that you're standing on, that's implied in school that people absorb no matter what, if you go there, is this bizarre idea that you need to, you're always on the verge of losing a competition. You need to struggle and struggle. If you lose that competition, your whole life is destroyed. And I really felt this in school. I lived in this, so I'm speaking from experience. And I could tell what was implied. A lot of people don't notice some of the implications, but I had a sense of them. But your life, you feel like your life is on the line, especially me. I was thinking about being a doctor and stuff. And, but I was raised from when I was little. Like I was in second grade and I was taught that by both school and my family that they determine your track, like even now, like they categorize you, and it's not even false, right? It's both true and not true. There's a truth and there's a not truth to it. But you get labeled and categorized and grouped when you're based on how you do in kindergarten and first grade, and you test. And if you don't stay on that top track, then everything's apparently more difficult. And if you fail like one test, sometimes you feel like you're at least that you're going to have to make up for it big time. So you have to work so much harder. So you're always like every day is just like you're ready to ruin your life, right? In school. And not you're ready to, but you're like, if you don't perform up to a certain standard and do a whole bunch of stuff that you don't want to do, that you feel like your life could be basically ruined either permanently or you have a big hole you have to dig out from. And what are you trying to do? It's like you're trying to outcompete other people because only a few people can have a career that's satisfying, gives them a bunch of money, and everyone else is just a loser in life, right? They pump gas, right? Again, this is what I was basically told explicitly. And I wasn't the only one, right? I grew up in a normal culture, not a weird culture. Yeah, you're starting to see it, right? Like when you look at, again, the deep assumptions that are implicit within school, right? Again, why would you have to compete with other people if there wasn't just a scarce thing? And you have to compete and beat a lot of people, right? You're supposed to come out near the top, right? If not, you get this unsatisfying career. And you can say, if someone says, David, no, that's not implied, then I ask, what's the point? It has to be implied because then why do your homework? Your parents tell you should do your homework. The only reason to do your homework is to what? Do a combination of pleasing authority and or outcompeting your fellow student. It's basically both. And even if we eliminate one of them, the other one's right. Right. You the only reason to there's two possible reasons. There's two or three possible reasons to do your homework. One is to please an authority figure. Second is to outcompete your peers. In ironically, part of outcompeting them is to please the authority figure better. Right. The other is theoretically because the actual learning is critical. Right. But the test is not the learning. And again, the idea that it's radically urgent when you're 7 years old to learn a bunch of things, right? If it's really about the learning, then how is it possible that it's so urgent at 7? And then what the hell are you learning? Geography? If you look at the stuff that you learn in school, it's 90+% of it is irrelevant, especially after the first few grades, right? You don't use any of it. And if you were going to use it, you were going to pick it up anyway for reading. You think you were going to be illiterate for your whole life? Like that's just nonsense, right? And nearly everything you learn is just moronic in terms of making money. And if it's not for making money, what's the freaking urgency and craziness and the coercion for it? If it's, oh no, it's not about making money, it's about being an informed citizen. What the freak? To be an informed citizen, it's illegal to not show up. Like it's all, anything that people say is some other conclusion, you can just dissolve it. It makes no sense, right? You're not in school. If it's to be a better person, then what? You're abused into being a better person. That's it. And what if I don't want to be a better person? Is there some punishment for it? You see what I'm saying? So what if it's just to be a good citizen and an informed citizen? Then why would I study for a test? If I could really understood that, you just wouldn't go to school. Because you just like, I'll just be a better, good citizen some other way that I choose. Or just maybe I could just drop the goal of being a good citizen, whatever the hell that means. Then I don't need to study for any tests. I don't need to do my homework. Don't need to listen to authority figure. Don't need to do all the things you didn't want to do in school. You could have just dropped if you could have had the opportunity to drop the goal of being a supposed good citizen, whatever that, if that was the point. And if it's to make money again, then we're back to what I said. There must be a scarce few jobs because you have to jump through all these hoops nonstop and keep pleasing these authority figures in a circular way. They make the tests and you have to pass, right? There's no real life stuff. And then they choose the subjects and they're all nonsense subjects, earth science, right? And you can read earth science in one freaking book. You just there's all kinds of nonfiction books, like popular books that are fun to read. You just read them and you'll know as much or more as what you studied for a whole freaking year or whatever, right? It's just nonsense. It's only because it's so ingrained in us that these topics matter. They're just nonsense topics. If you look at it, they're all just circular to justify people having power over you and just everything. There's no conspiracy or anything. It's just a system that gets crazy. People have these ideas and they're nonsense about controlling people and better citizens and all that. But if you start to unravel it, it just becomes insane. Yeah, I need to talk about school because we have the abuse from it. We have all these horrible ideas from it, and we have no idea. Again, they're invisible. That this also illustrates what I mean about you don't see the frames you're standing on, or you don't see these things. You have to reason backwards in a certain way to see them. I'm still trying to describe better and better how to do that. But there's more stuff lots of wonderful things to get to as I continue with these office hours that are the same, the webinars, but the framing helps relax me during the time on my side or during the week. Oh, for you, it wasn't pumping gas, it was digging dishes, right? Yeah, these days you can't pump gas, it's all automated. You felt yeah, Mike said I felt totally shattered when I got a C in biology, right? It's like your whole college track and career track is like off, right? But you really feel it. It seems odd looking back, but it felt so real at the time. And then we keep it in life, right? Where we have these bizarre anxieties. Why shouldn't you be able to take 6 months if you just have enough money? And 6 months of money, if you live frugally, is just like a few $1,000s, actually. Except for all the implicit expectations of your family, right? But if you step back and think about all the things that you feel like you have to do and then try to figure out where they're coming from, so many of them dissolve into nonsense. Or they're like nonsense in the minds of people close to you. And you try to do your best balancing them not going to pieces with stuff. Okay, well that's another good thing to explain. I'll probably just about cut things off here. Lauren says, I still feel anxiety when I think about learning something new, even after going through all this with you. It's crazy. See, it's amazing, right? But you should need to understand, in order to recover from it, you need to understand that school is the equivalent of sexual abuse for learning, literally and fully. And that's just the reality. So we need to make decisions based on that. James says, most of mainstream education funnels the masses into live job security. Correct. Unlike what is taught inside OMG. But also what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the typical complaints about school are more like they're valid, but they're more associative, right? Oh, it was based on agricultural society or it's to make money for teachers. A lot of it is just like the things that I pointed out are more about the deep frame that it implies and that they're standing on. And that's where I really know. And of course, it's fueled with extortion by people who are comfortable with getting their money from extortion, right? So it's just a lot of stuff. But I've already said that, so I wanted to point out new things. Unlike what's taught inside OMG, which is the excellent foundational information that all the coaches share. James Wright, thank you, James. Creating your own business in an exciting field like digital marketing, and SEO is life changing and a confidence builder each and every day. Thanks, David. You're very welcome, James. Excellent. Okay, so we'll probably end the webinar just about here. And thank you guys so much again. Wonderful participation and for coming on live and so forth. Everyone, check out Bates' cool video on how to avoid being sued for sexual harassment, which is also cool because obviously most of us might feel like it's unlikely we'll actually be sued, but it's nice to know the specific information so you don't have to worry about how it affected your behavior on the way to it. She posted that in the HP team group. And I have yet to watch the whole thing. I started it before the webinar, but then I had the webinar and a number of things today. You're very welcome, Brian. I'm glad that I was able to cover that. I'm glad these things occurred to me during this week, so I was able to cover it. Our type of education is such a crap, even with this Megan Lee, even with a master's in writing, was never taught that writing could be a way to make money. Starving artist syndrome was the ideal. And now you're doing great. With OMG and your sales formulas, I finally began to write as a means of creating value. And the way you explain it, it's creative and so enjoyable and it pays. It's just awesome. I'm so love how you created something for yourself, a hybrid of what you had already at OMG and made something for yourself. Just terrific, Megan. Look forward to having Megan talk. She's gonna be able to share some really cool stuff about content and so forth as relates to SEO at OMG Live. One of many good insider speakers that has some great insider information for us. Hope everyone will be there at OMG Live. I'll be around the whole time. We'll have lots of good discussions. Probably in the evening, realistically, we'll have a night talk in the room when some people are Drake, and I'll probably stay there in the conference room and we'll probably a bunch of us will talk around in a circle for an hour or two or more at night, one or two of the nights at OMG Live. So that would be really cool. I'm almost certain they'll work out that way. The trouble for me with drinks is it's hard to talk and people to hear. And people like to talk to me about stuff where we have to have more in-depth talk about, basically have to hear each other. And so I'll also go to Drake's, but in the past. spent a good amount of time just talking in kind of a circle. Yeah, drunk alchemy. I did it before. It's funny how practically speaking, how rarely I drink. It just doesn't really come up, but I have no problem with it. Don't do it. I don't know that I've drank since maybe once or twice at home for a little bit. Not like in my closet alone or anything, but just at night. I did some drunk watching some once with my wife. We don't drink hardly at all, but we had some wine. I think they sent it to me from I think the car dealership sent me some wine as part of buying my car. That was hilarious stuff. We're laughing so hard. That's funny. You had to be there in person for stuff like that. Might never be repeated. All right, guys, have a wonderful week. And I hope I'll see you in Nashville, and I will talk to you on webinar next week. I presume it'll be in a week. I'll confirm on a couple days. All right, guys, I'll post this as an MP3. Did I not post last week as an MP3? If not, I apologize. Oh my goodness. I also wanted to mention that Megan has gotten a number of transcripts made of the Capstone series, the recent one. And I haven't posted them, but I'll post them within a day or so. And I think have you sent me 3, right, Megan? In the third one, you said one was on the way, but I think that must be a new one. But anyway, I believe it's 3, definitely 2, 3 so far. So I'll post those 3 within approximately, and I believe I'll post it within a day or so, at least almost certainly by Friday. And then did I miss the MP3 from last week? I thought I posted it. If not, I'll check. But anyway, of course, I'll post this one too. Usually these weeks I post this stuff by Friday. Okay, now I'll really end it, but I thought I wanted to tell you about what Megan did, and so you look out for that by Friday. It's posted. Just love to read. Listen, great. Okay, yeah, I'll post the MP3, of course. Okay, have a wonderful week. See you guys.